Welcome to the last night of Soapbox Science Sydney's online events for 2020. We have 3 great speakers lined up tonight covering coral reefs, maggots and sharks, and we hope you tune in for them all. I'm Laura McCaughey and I will be your host tonight, asking our speakers the questions you're dying to know and the answers to. But before we dive into tonight's session, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands UTS's City campus, from which we are streaming, now stands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I'll start with a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during tonight's webinar, please type them in the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel, and we'll ask our speaker these over the duration of their talk. You can ask questions anonymously, and also if you like a question someone else has asked and would like it answered, then please use the upvoting tool, which is the wee thumbs up symbol next to the question itself. This session will also be recorded, but we won't be recording any video or audio input from the audience. If you have any concerns or questions over this, you can contact the Soapbox team via email at soapboxsciencesydney@gmail.com. You may be wondering what Soapbox Science is, or you may have come across it in its original pre-COVID format, which is researchers standing on soapboxes wearing lab coats in very busy public places, like shopping centres or Circular Quay, where we had Sydney's first Soapbox Science event last year. The premise behind both the in-person and online Soapbox Science events is for the public to interact with, question and probe some of our nation's most fabulous researchers in science, technology, engineering and maths. We want these events to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions as we go along. Our brilliant speaker tonight is Dr. Jennifer Matthews, who before starting her PhD was a marine conservation manager at Big Blue Conservation in Thailand. Jen is now a marine biologist and postdoctoral research fellow in the Future Reefs Group of the Climate Change Cluster at the University of Technology, Sydney. Her research focuses on marine symbiosis and coral reef conservation with the aim of supporting coral health and fitness to enable corals to survive environmental change. I'll now hand over to Jen to hear all about her fascinating coral research.
Thank you so much for joining me today or this evening and for putting some time apart this evening to listen to me. So coral reefs are beautiful, colourful and incredibly diverse natural environments. And what do I mean by diverse? Well, besides the corals, there's hundreds of fish, turtles, sharks, rays, dolphins and whales, and even tiny plant-like organisms that we call plankton. And all of these live on a coral reef. And they actually make this huge diverse ecosystem that is extremely valuable to us as humans because they can help keep our food chains moving. For example, there's small fish that eat that small algae, and then there's bigger fish such as tuna that then eat the smaller fish, and then humans can eat the tuna. So there's many of the creatures that we actually depend on in our life live at one point in their life on a coral reef or depend on food from coral reefs. And coral reefs can cover huge areas. In fact, did you know that we can see the Great Barrier Reef from space? That's pretty big. And because of the huge areas that they expand over, they can actually provide coastal protection. So they can slow down the wave action, and that can help protect coastlines from things like storm events or large wave action. And they also provide huge economic value. So I don't know about you, but I love to go snorkeling and scuba diving on reefs. And so they actually support a big tourism and recreation industry. And for smaller countries around the world, there's many fishermen that actually depend on their reefs in their small countries for income and for food. And did you know, though, that we can actually get many of the medicines that we have used in our life from coral reefs? So in fact, treatments for cancer have come from coral reefs, as well as Alzheimer's, bacterial and viral infections, and who knows, maybe the vaccine for coronavirus will be discovered on the Great Barrier Reef. But corals are facing their own pandemic. And one of those things that they're facing is direct human pressures. So for example, overfishing. This removes some of the smaller fish, for example, that they will eat all the algae and keep the algae in check and help keep the level of the algae growing on the reefs at a low level so it doesn't overgrow the coral. Removing those fish means that the algae will outgrow the coral and threaten the coral reefs. And then there's larger fish such as sharks. These help keep the population of those grazing fish, those cow-like fish, in check. And removing too many of those larger fish means those smaller fish can grow to larger populations, and then they'll start to eat everything on the reef, including the coral itself, which we don't want either. So it's a very fine diversity balance that we have on our coral reefs. Pollution is another problem, so especially plastic pollution and pollution that runs off the land. It can carry mud with it that smothers the corals. But also chemical pollution is a huge issue, including sunscreen. So I'm sure you have all been to a beach and perhaps you've applied your sunscreen diligently, but maybe you've entered the water too soon and that sunscreen has washed off you. Then it means it's not protecting you, but it's actually also harmful to corals. So one way that you can help protect corals is actually applying sunscreen an hour before you enter the water. That way it protects you and it protects the coral. And then oceans are becoming warmer and warmer for longer, and they're becoming more acidic. So these widespread environmental changes are also impacting the reef. So just imagine if you didn't have enough to eat, if your house was filled with plastic and pollution, and then it got really hot and the air that you're breathing is toxic and full of acid, you would probably get really sick. Well, reefs and all the organisms living on them are experiencing this right now. And this has led to a catastrophic loss of reefs around the world and continues to threaten those that remain. So that's already quite a lot of information. So I'm going to pause there now just to take a few questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Jen, for that great introduction. We do have some questions. People want to know, where in the world are coral reefs? So we know about the Great Barrier Reef, but where else do you get some coral reefs?
Well, coral reefs, they tend to have a very defined area that they like to live in. They're very sensitive to temperature ranges. So we typically find them in tropical areas, but there are some in subtropical areas. In fact, anybody in Sydney is going to find some corals off the coast of Sydney as well. We've got some subtropical corals just off Manly, in fact. So you can find corals all around the world in this fine area, which perhaps is around 22 to 35 degrees in the temperature of water. They also have a very distinct salinity that they prefer as well. So they're defined to these areas. So they're not everywhere, but...
It's always good when your husband gets bored of your talk 3 minutes in and puts Netflix on instead.
It's very useful that he's an AV technician and can sort this out pretty quickly.
So we've got some more questions. What do you think will stop mass bleaching events in the Great Barrier Reef?
The only thing really that's going to stop mass bleaching events is removing the pressures of climate change. And climate change is kind of that elephant in the room. It's definitely something that we need to consider, and it's also a huge problem. And I think the only way that we're really going to be able to tackle that is if we have dedication from marine scientists and researchers, decision makers and politicians, and also the general public getting involved. So yeah, the only thing that can stop mass bleaching is reducing the effects of climate change.
On that note, what is our biggest impact on the reefs dying?
The biggest impacts of the reefs, if the reefs die, what would happen? Well, if all the reefs die, then many of the fish won't have any place to live, or the food that they depend on won't have any place to live. So a lot of our marine ecosystems will collapse. And with that, all of the food that we depend on from the reefs as well, they will also collapse. So we won't have tuna, and we won't have the fish or the shellfish that you might like to eat. And you won't have the tourism industries that are associated with it as well. So the fishing industries and all of those economic valuable things. And maybe we might lose some of the medical properties that we could obtain from reefs.
Yeah, I'm sure there's so many untapped resources in the reef that if they disappeared, we'd be losing out a lot and we wouldn't even know what we were losing out on.
Yeah.
Has the lockdown with COVID affected pollution and improved water quality at all? Because there's less people out and about, there's less people out in their boats.
That's a really interesting question, and one I reckon that we'll start to see a lot of research from. So I imagine that, yes, with the decrease in the amount that we've traveled, with the reduction in just general global emissions, we might see some benefits in the long term. But in the short term, certainly we're already seeing some benefits. This year has been a remarkable year for coral spawning. Quite why is unknown, but it seems to be really, we've had a lot of really successful spawning events in America at the moment. So perhaps this is due to a reduction in the number of people visiting it, perhaps a reduction in the amount of sunscreen that's polluting the waters, and just general boat traffic. Maybe this is making the water quality preferable for them. So I would really like to see if this year we see a marked increase in survival or a reduction in the loss of corals. That would be really interesting, because it shows that those direct pressures from recreational and industrial pressures, such as fishing and the sunscreen and everything like that, whether that's having such a direct and immediate effect on the loss of corals. It would be really interesting.
You've just mentioned a few times there sun cream damages corals. Why is that? And now I feel bad because I lather my kids up and myself up, being Scottish. We have to, but yeah, I think we have a lot of sun cream going into the water.
As you should absolutely should wear sunscreen. Please don't take this home that you shouldn't wear sunscreen. Please protect your skin. It's lots of people put it on and then immediately go in the water, and it takes about an hour for that sunscreen to sink into your skin before it gives you protection and before it doesn't wash off into the water. And sunscreens are made up of chemicals, and even like some of the ones that you see that are invisible sprays and stuff, they're all full of chemicals. The best thing you can do is protect yourself, but you can also find some natural sunscreens. If you are desperate to get in the water as quickly as you can, then that's the best one to apply. But we actually don't know very much about what it is exactly in the sunscreen that's hurting the corals. But if you can imagine diving into a vat of chemicals, it's probably you're not going to like it too much, so the corals are going to feel the same.
Okay, lesson learned, note taken, sun cream on at least an hour before I go swimming. Done. You mentioned spawning, and I've watched a documentary at some point, and is it true that does it only happen at like once a month, or is it once a year that the big spawning events happen, or am I thinking of something totally different?
So it really depends on the species. There's some species of corals that spawn every month, but there's some that are determined by the temperature of the water. And it's really such a fine art that, again, we know so little about. So for example, I used to work in Thailand, as you mentioned earlier, and we would find that the coral would spawn, or we would see a large coral spawning at 8:15, 4 days after full moon in April. It was that specific.
Wow.
And it was so strange to be diving at that point, and then you see all of a sudden all the corals release all of their eggs, and it's quite remarkable. And then it just stops about 15 minutes later, completely stops. And so it's really quite how they know, it's really unknown at the moment, but we think it's something to do with the light intensity from the moon, and as well the temperature of the water. There might be some chemical signals, those kind of things that initiate this mass spawning event.
That was really fascinating. That was what the documentary I was watching talked about, how it was like so precise on like a certain day every time of the year. It's really fascinating how they do it.
It really have to be, if you think about it. If they've got one chance to do it, they have to do synchronized, because otherwise, if one egg is male and one coral is male and one coral is female, if they release at different times, then that's not going to mix in the water. So they have to be precise. And this could be a coral that's 100 meters away from another coral, and they are doing it at exactly the same moment. So yeah, it has to be.
That's really amazing. We've got a question here. Why are coral cuts so dangerous? Are corals dirty? And when I went diving up at the Great Barrier Reef, I cut my leg on coral and it took months to heal, and I've still got a big scar from it. So I want to know the answer to this as well.
Well, the best thing to do is stop kicking coral. That would definitely help you. So corals, just like our skin, is covered in bacteria to help protect us from getting any infections, and they're protective bacteria. They're good, what we consider good bacteria. You can also get bad bacteria, and the corals, they have good bacteria or probiotic bacteria on their tissue layer, on their outer tissue layer too. But if you scratch yourself with coral, then that that kind of foreign bacteria, while it's safe to the coral, is maybe not safe to you. So then that bacteria gets in your skin, and maybe some of the bad bacteria on your skin also finds its way in. And corals have stinging cells as well. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute, but those stinging cells will actually damage the tissue around where you got cut. So that will reduce your chances at being able to fend off that bacteria.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about that. So I'll hand back over to you. You can tell us all about stinging corals. Why is everything in Australia so deadly? Everything stings you, bites you, or kills you? Oh, anyway, right, over to you, Jen.
Well, at least all you've got in Scotland to worry about is the cold, I guess. So
Yeah. Cold and rain. Right, I want to hear all about this. Thanks.
So why are we losing corals? Well, to answer this, we really need to talk a little bit about what corals are, how they're formed. So of you listening tonight, what do you think a coral is? Do you think it's a plant? Do you think it's an animal? Do you think it's a rock? It's actually a bit of a trick question because it's all three. So the coral animal itself is similar to a jellyfish. It's actually translucent or colorless and clear, and you can see right through its tissues. And it has these tiny little stinging cells that it used to sting food out of the water, like plankton or phytoplankton, zooplankton, all these tiny little organisms. And it even has a mouth. So it uses these tentacles to start moving the food towards its mouth. But it's not very good at getting its own food this way. And actually, it's because of that it's developed a relationship with a tiny algae cell that lives in its tissues. And these algae, they are really tiny. They're in fact 10,000th of a centimeter. So really, really small. But the coral has millions of these algae in its tissues. And this algae is a plant. So just how trees provide us with oxygen, the algae provide the corals with nutrients for survival too. And this is what is called a symbiosis. So this symbiotic relationship is not specific to corals. We actually have symbionts ourselves. I spoke a little bit earlier about the symbiotic bacteria on our skin, but we also have specific symbiotic bacteria in our guts. And this helps us break down the food, and it actually helps us to get as many nutrients out of our food as possible so that we can grow big and strong, big, healthy bones. And the same thing happens for corals and their algae. So that together they can form these huge, beautiful calcium carbonate bone-like structures. And I have some here to show you. So this is my favorite coral. This is called a mushroom coral. This is a single coral polyp. And you can actually see where the mouth used to be. So this is just the skeleton. There's no tissue or algae on it anymore. But this is a free-living coral. It's one of the only ones. And it's able to, with the wave actions, move down the reef, and it can expand over entire reef flats. So they're really cool. I really love these corals. But they can be, when this is only a single mouth, they can have hundreds and hundreds of mouths and form these beautiful, intricate branch-like structures. So this is typically what you would see on a reef, and probably what you saw behind me earlier before the Netflix showed up. But then in the tiny little dots in the middle, those are their mouths. So much, much smaller mouths in these corals. But then you might get some plate-like structures. This is just a fragment of a plate coral. You've got all these plates that can be meters wide. And all of these structures, they used to have a color, and that color came from the algae, and that algae provide them with those beautiful pinks and yellows, bright greens, all those diverse colors. When corals get sick though, that symbiosis with the algae breaks down. For example, if the water is too hot, then the coral loses its algae. And this is what we call coral bleaching, because essentially then without that color, you see right through the coral's tissue to the white skeleton underneath, giving it a bleached appearance. So this is coral bleaching, if you've ever heard of it before. Now, it's really important to know that coral bleaching doesn't necessarily mean that the coral is dead. It's just really sick. So for example, if you weren't able to eat the amount of food that you normally eat, you would get sick too. So does the coral. It's not with its algae, it's not getting enough nutrients, it's nutrient deficient. So it's not very happy, and if it was left this way for too long, it would die, much like the fate of these corals. But some algae or some corals are able to withstand environmental changes. And this is really important for the survival and resilience of coral reefs. quite how they can withstand these changes, well, actually part of it comes down to the nutrients that they're getting from the algae. So if you eat lots of chocolate and lots of sweets, maybe you feel full of energy because of all of the sugars that you're getting from the chocolate and the sweets. If you drink your orange juice, you're going to get your vitamin C to help you defend against infections. Or if you eat lots of chips and burgers, maybe you'll put on a little bit of fat. If you eat your broccoli, you'll have big, strong, healthy muscles. And maybe you've heard that blueberries provide you with antioxidants to help keep your skin all radiant and fresh. So the corals have the same thing. They get the same diverse nutrients from their algae. For example, antioxidants that they get from the algae can help them survive these hotter temperatures. And this is what I research. We know so little about what is exchanged from the algae to the coral, but it could unlock the secret to how corals can survive climate change. So how exactly do I do this research? So, for example, I might go to a reef and collect some coral. I'll bring it back to the lab and we'll put it into some controlled tank conditions. One of these tanks might simulate the reef's normal temperatures and normal light. And one of them, I might increase the temperature of the water. And then with that increased temperature, I will take the samples or take coral samples at exactly the same time. So I've got one that's under normal conditions to compare to one under stress conditions. I can then compare the metabolites between the two treatments and see which ones or what metabolites are different. And this might actually help me pinpoint what we call biomarkers. These are essentially diagnostic nutrients that we can say this metabolite was significantly higher or lower compared to one treatment. And we can then use this to inform us, perhaps go back onto a reef, collect samples directly off a reef, see the level of that biomarker, and it can tell us about the winners and the losers on coral reefs. So that's a little bit about my research. I'm going to pause there again to see if anybody has any questions about my research.
Thanks, Jen. We do have a few questions. I want to start with, how often do you get to visit the reef? Because I always see people doing other postdocs or PhDs and they just look so much more fun than mine. Like getting to go and dive as part of your work, that must be pretty cool.
Yeah, at the moment, not so much, unfortunately, with the restrictions, but generally we try to visit the reef once a month or at least once a year. It really depends on what we're doing. Sometimes we're up at the reef for a month at a time, but it's only once a year. It depends. For example, if we're going to see some spawning or to collect some spawning, then it will be very defined times in the year that we go up. And it also depends on the experiments that we're doing. If we're running a in situ, so actual on the reef bleaching experiments, then it will be defined to the summer seasons, whereas if we perhaps want to see them under non-stress conditions, we might go spring, winter, autumn.
What's your favourite time of year to dive the reef?
When it's warmer. I'm a bit of a wimp. I much prefer warmer waters. Not too hot, obviously. I don't like to see coral bleaching all that much. In fact, I remember my first ever trip to a coral reef was during a coral bleaching event. And it was in Thailand where I learned to dive. And I remember seeing all these beautiful, vibrant colors. There was like fluorescent pink and fluorescent blue and fluorescent yellow. This is when I just finished my undergraduate, and didn't really know anything about corals at that point. I didn't study marine biology. I studied straight biology, and so I'd never really known about corals. I thought they were all rocks, and so I went down and I saw these big, beautiful colors and these huge things. I thought they're so beautiful, and I came up to the surface and asked my instructor what they were, and they said, "This is actually coral bleaching. They're not very healthy right now," and that just sparked my fascination into corals and coral bleaching. So I definitely don't like diving during bleaching events, but it did spark my inspiration for my career. So maybe I should be grateful to it. I don't know. But yeah, I definitely prefer diving in warmer weathers. In Sydney, I guess that my favorite time for that reason would be around March, April time when the water is a bit warmer. And the clarity of the water is still pretty good as well.
We've got a question about your research, or related to your research. Can we feed corals to make them feel better? If they've not got enough nutrients, can we go in and give them some?
That's a really interesting question, and one that, you know, I would really like to explore. Can we dose metabolites or certain nutrients onto the reef? Can we directly feed them? Well, I'm not so sure. Because of the water movement, it would probably wash away anything that we put on directly onto the reef. But what we can do is we could take the algae that we know are performing really well, perhaps those ones that we know give the best nutrients, and we can encourage a symbiosis at the larval state. So perhaps we can encourage the corals to take up the symbionts that are better preparing them for future environments. And there's a number of researchers around the world who are looking into the potential of this. So yeah.
So can all corals take up all different types of algae, or do you have like specific corals will only have specific algae and you can't really make them change?
Definitely, yeah. There's definitely a level of symbiosis specificity in corals. We do see corals that house a number of different species of the algae, because actually of this algae, when I'm talking about the different algae, there's hundreds of different species of this algae, hundreds and hundreds. And it's now been actually reclassed as a family, this particular algae. So it's very, very diverse. And there are some corals that are flexible and able to associate with different types. So there's some that are very specific. And it's that specificity that typically the ones that are causing, or that will suffer from bleaching, because they're unable to maybe change and change the levels of symbionts and get the nutrients from those symbionts that are better performing. But this is still a question in science, whether we can, or in marine research, whether we can actually manipulate this symbiosis to get a more optimal symbiosis. But research seems to point at the moment that that specificity will prevent that.
How do corals grow, and how long do they take to grow? So if you had a mass bleaching event, how long would it take to grow new corals to replace the ones that died?
So corals can be incredibly slow growing. Some corals, for example, I don't have any here, but for some corals, the big boulder corals that you see, those grow less than a centimeter a year, like very, very slow. So those huge boulders that you see, they can be thousands of years old, really, really old. But then things like mushroom corals, they typically grow to this size in less than a year. So some corals can grow quite fast. But mushroom corals aren't reef building corals, because they're able to move with the wave action. So not really going to build up those big structures. They'll just float off down the reef. But these ones, like these branching corals, about 7 centimeters a year. So if you think about it, if we lose an entire colony, like even this size, then this could be years before we were able to replace it. So because of their slow growth, that's one of the reasons why coral cover around the world is diminishing.
Do you get any corals that are not bad corals but will outgrow other corals and therefore reduce diversity, if some are fast growing and some are slow growing?
Yeah, I mean, you get a certain amount of competition on the reef between corals. Some are faster, as you say, faster growing than others. Some with the larger polyps, they actually are able to eat the smaller corals. So there's some fascinating images of that. I definitely advise you to go and have a look in Google afterwards at coral competition and them eating each other as they spit out their stomachs, essentially, and their stomachs degrade the coral that's next to them. So it's really, really quite violent, but it's fascinating. So yeah, there is competition on the reef, just as there's competition in a forest for the different trees, but there's also little niches or little areas of the reef that they're specialized in. So typically you would find maybe the big boulder corals would be a little bit shallower, because those big boulder structures are able to withstand the increased wave action that comes with shallower water, whereas the more fragile branching corals, they might be further down or deeper in the reef, because they're less able to withstand that hard wave action, because they're a bit more brittle, but they're able to grow up towards the sunlight, which they need for photosynthesis for their algae to get the nutrients. So yeah, so they tend to have their own little pockets on the reef as well that they are better adapted to.
Oh, so they know who to avoid. They know what enemies to avoid.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of time, I want to hear a bit more about your research, and then we'll wrap up in a few minutes with more Q&A.
I just want to talk a little bit now about hope. So coral bleaching, it is severe. In 2016, for example, in the Northern Great Barrier Reef, it lost 2/3 of its coral cover due to coral bleaching. And some of the corals, as I said earlier, were thousands of years old. So to replenish those, it would take thousands of years to regrow what we lost in only a few months. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to take a lot of dedicated marine scientists, decision makers, politicians, but also dedication from the general public. But I still have hope for coral reefs. Corals are actually hundreds of millions of years old. They even survived the extinction of dinosaurs. So corals are badass. If they can survive the extinction of dinosaurs, they can survive mass bleaching. And there are corals that have, and entire reefs that have survived the mass bleaching events that we've experienced recently. And only a fraction of corals survives. If only a fraction of a colony survive, it is able to grow and expand. If we are able to protect it, provide it with a little bit of time to grow, and to provide it with the time and protection it needs to withstand any other changes or any other challenges experienced on the reef. And so the coral can also regain its territory from perhaps from algae that's starting to outgrow it. As I mentioned earlier, there's competition on the reef, but the corals can actually defend themselves if given the opportunity. It can withstand diseases if it gets enough resources from its algae that lives in its tissues. But the more stresses that we take off of them locally, the better chance they have of replenishing and regrowing. So if we can reduce the overfishing, reduce pollution, reduce or making sure that we're doing sustainable coastal construction, these kind of things will give us enough time to stabilize the climate and actually help reduce climate change and the effects of mass bleaching. And there are actually a number of projects around the world that are giving us this extra hope as well. And they're looking for solutions to many of the problems. So for example, some of the times when you often find coral bleaching during the summer when the light's a lot more intense. And we've found that if you shade coral, so you can put a shade cloth across coral colonies, that helps reduce the light intensity that the corals are experiencing and help them survive mass bleaching. There's also people who are building coral nurseries. These are a great way to propagate coral colonies, especially those that survive mass bleaching events. And there's coral nurseries being constructed around the world, including on the Great Barrier Reef fostered by the Coral Nurture Program. And there's reef reseeding, which is essentially allowing when a coral produces larvae, little baby corals, they produce hundreds of thousands of them, but only 1% survive. So there's projects out there that are actually helping larvae to reach a more mature age where they can better withstand the other pressures on reefs, such as competition and being eaten by fish. So there's these reef reseeding projects as well, which are really hopeful. Marine protected areas, they help prevent overfishing in certain areas, which can definitely benefit coral reefs. And also, interestingly, around marine protected areas, we see an indirect benefit to the reefs around it because they're benefiting from that increased diversity from the marine protected areas. So they're really important too. And even beach cleanups, such as those planned by the Australian microplastic project, they plan them on a monthly basis, and they're collecting plastics from tiny little fragments of plastic to straws, and you can do it even on your next visit to a beach. If you see a piece of plastic, pick it up and pop it in the bin, and you are directly contributing to saving our oceans. So I think that's probably all I have time for.
Thanks, Jen. I like that you're ending on a positive note with all the good things that can come to try and save the corals. We've got a few questions here. How deep can coral live? Like, where does the light stop?
So we can find corals really deep, but the corals that I'm talking about here, the symbiotic ones, they typically live in where the light can penetrate. So maximum 40 meters, but really we see them around the limits of 30 meters, depending on where in the world. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to Hawaii, but the amount of sedimentation from land runoff means that the light kind of stops penetrating at about 10 meters. So generally a lot of the reefs are confined to the top 5 meters or top 10 meters. Whereas in Thailand, the water is a lot clearer and the reefs are a little bit more offshore. And so we see reefs and corals growing all the way down to 40 meters, what I did anyway. 5 years ago, so don't know about now. But.
I didn't know that they went that deep.
Yes.
That's really interesting. A question here from Joanna, and this might save my skin. Does using waterproof sun cream work?
So waterproof sun cream will work, absolutely, but it still needs time to sink into your skin. So again, applying it, leaving it for an hour, making sure it's well and truly settled in your skin, and that will help yourself. If you're going in the water, that will definitely, being waterproof, it will definitely protect you for longer. And also, I guess it reduces the chances that it's going to wash off and into the ocean as well.
Okay, still taking on note, at least an hour before I go in. Okay, how much of a temperature increase causes the bleaching?
It really depends on the area. So if you're a coral and you typically experience temperatures up to 26 degrees, even a temperature change up to 27 degrees could result in bleaching. But then if you're used to 35 degrees, 27 is not going to bleach you. But so it really is kind of dependent on the area and the species of corals. Some corals, as I mentioned earlier, some corals are a little bit more able to withstand temperature changes. So a 1 degree centigrade change is not going to cause it to bleach. Maybe a 2 or a 1.5 or a 2 centigrade will make it bleach. So it really depends on the species. But typically when we talk about bleaching, we're talking about an increase to the thermal maxima, that the seasonal thermal maxima that is typically experienced in that area. So we can say mass bleaching in that indirect way, and it associates to just an increase in the temperature that they normally experience in that area that has caused them to bleach.
Does coral dying affect sea levels? Like if there is less coral taking up space, do sea levels go down?
That is such an interesting question, and I've never ever thought of that before. You know what? I have no idea. I guess it could do, but the thing is that with if the corals are dying from mass bleaching, that's because the oceans are becoming warmer. The oceans are becoming warmer, then you're getting more ice melting into the water. And that will perhaps raise the sea levels because there's more water than ice than before. And the other thing to think about as well is that this isn't the only thing that's occurring. The mass bleaching due to temperature changes isn't the only thing that's killing corals. There's also acidification of the ocean. And that can be... acidification can actually, I don't know if that can change the water levels either. It's such an interesting question. I've never really thought of it. I'm going to go look at it now.
Yep, something else for you to go and research.
Yeah.
What can we do as individuals to help the reefs? Apart from not kicking them like I did.
Apart from not kicking them. So there's small things that you could do. For example, helping reduce the amount of pollution that you put into the ocean. There's no doubt that with plastic pollution, there's no doubt that reducing or reusing and recycling any plastic that you do use will help reduce that plastic pollution. As we mentioned earlier with the sunscreen, that will always help. How can you help? So there will often be around marine protected areas, there will be certain rules. So obeying those rules is really useful. Not to get into politics, but supporting policy initiatives that are directed towards protecting environments, that will certainly help protect coral reefs. And that's one really easy way that you can get indirectly involved, even if you lived in a landlocked country. And as well, visiting coral reefs, going and having a look, seeing how amazing they are and everything that they have to offer. That will help inspire you, and hopefully you'll see some ways that maybe you can make a change, maybe a new solution that we haven't even thought of yet.
One last sciencey question. How big is the Great Barrier Reef? Is it the biggest reef in the world?
So I believe it is the biggest reef in the world. I may be corrected on that, but I do believe it is the biggest reef in the world. I think it expands over 2,000 kilometers. So I don't know the exact extent of it anymore. I don't know if anybody does because of the mass bleaching and the losses of corals that we've experienced. I don't know if it's ever been measured recently, but I believe it's over 2,000 kilometers, I think.
Wow, that really is some size.
It's very big. To be able to be seen from space, that's pretty impressive.
One last question. Why did you get into science, and what is it you love about it?
So I think I mentioned earlier my experience of getting into coral research, but I love science discovery. My actual science career all stemmed from finding out about DNA. So I was fascinated by the fact that this tiny, tiny molecules that we can't even see determines how fast we are, how tall we are, our eye color, whether we're good at art or whether we're good at music. All of these things, it's predetermined and written in our cells. And that for me was fascinating, and I wanted to know how. I'm really interested in how things work, I guess. And I think that kind of was what led me onto the path of being a scientist. And then it was just wanting to make a change and wanting to make a difference. I then studied conservation science, and that's what led me to Thailand, just to try diving, to see what it was like underwater. And then I saw the corals and the state that they were in, and that's what led me to that. Yeah.
Love at first sight with the coral.
Yeah, it was.
Well, thank you for a fascinating talk today, Jen. I've learned a lot about what I can personally do to help save coral reefs, particularly in terms of sun cream. I also want to thank everyone who attended Jen's talk and asked really great questions. If you want to watch this talk again, or you know someone who would have enjoyed it, then we'll be posting it on our website in the next week or so. You'll also receive a post-event email in the next 24 hours with an evaluation survey. Please fill this out, as it helps us to gauge the success of our events and make improvements for next year. We couldn't run Soapbox Science Sydney without our fabulous sponsors, so we'd like to thank the University of Technology Sydney, Excite on Science, Equus, and the University of Wollongong for their continued support in our events. We have 2 more great talks lined up tonight, starting with Michelle Harvey at 8 p.m, talking about the usefulness of maggots, and Juliana Kedar at 9 p.m, talking about shark tracking. You can join these talks from the link you're on now, or you can find more information on our website, soapboxsciencesydney.com. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you at the next talk.